Lady Alara Blackwood had saved an enemy once before, but that act of mercy would pale beside the choice that awaited her in the storm-lashed darkness outside her manor walls. Tonight, as rain hammered against the ancient stones of Blackwood Manor, she had no idea that her life was about to change forever, or that the stranger bleeding into her soil would become both her salvation and her ruin. Rain fell not like weather, but like penance, cold and relentless and without forgiveness. It drummed against the leaded windows with the rhythm of a funeral march, swept across the barren fields in sheets that blurred the edges between earth and sky, between memory and the hollow present that stretched before her like an unmarked grave. The storm had been building for days, pressing against the manor with the weight of something unfinished, something that demanded payment for debts she had never chosen to owe. Inside the great hall, Lady Alara moved like a ghost through rooms that had once echoed with laughter and now held only the whisper of her skirts against cold stone. She was 28, though the isolation had carved lines around her eyes that made her seem older, weathered like the manor itself by many seasons of solitude. Her husband's armor still stood in its place of honor beside the hearth, empty now for 3 years since Sir Robert had fallen at Acre. The metal dulled and cold as the ashes that filled the fireplace she no longer bothered to light. She wore her grief like a winter cloak wrapped tight about her shoulders, hands always half-tangled in its folds. But tonight the storm would not let her rest in the familiar rhythm of her sorrow. The wind howled through the eaves with a voice that spoke of things broken loose, of boundaries crossed and order overthrown. Through the shuttered windows, she could hear the panicked lowing of cattle, the sharp crack of wood giving way before the gale's fury. Alara pulled her woolen mantle close and lifted the heavy bar from the door. The courtyard beyond was a chaos of driving rain and flying debris, but she could not leave the animals to suffer for her reluctance to face the storm. She bent her head against the wind and pushed into the night, boots splashing through puddles that reflected nothing but darkness. It was there, as she struggled to secure the stable door against a wind that seemed determined to tear it from its hinges, that she saw the shape sprawled against the manor's outer wall. At first it seemed just another shadow cast by the storm, a trick of rain and lamplight. But shadows did not bleed, and this one lay too still, too broken, like something the tempest had torn from another world entirely and deposited at her threshold as a test she was not yet ready to understand. Alara approached the fallen figure, with the caution of one who had learned that the world offered more cruelty than kindness, her lantern casting uncertain light across what the storm had delivered to her threshold. The wind still howled like a living thing, but beneath its voice she could hear something else, the shallow, desperate rhythm of breath fighting to continue against impossible odds. The man lay crumpled against the stone like a broken bird, his face turned toward the wall as if seeking shelter even in unconsciousness. Dark hair, longer than any Christian knight would wear, spilled across features that spoke of distant lands and burning sands. His skin held the deep bronze of those who lived beneath an unforgiving sun, and even through the rain-soaked fabric of his robes she could see the rich patterns that marked him as no English peasant or travelling merchant. A curved sword lay half-buried in the mud beside him, its pommel worked with script that flowed like water across the metal. The sight of it struck her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. Saracen, the enemy her husband had died fighting, the infidel whose kind had spilled Christian blood across the Holy Land and left her a widow before her time. "My lady!" The voice came from behind her, sharp with fear. Old Thomas, her steward, stood in the doorway with 2 of the remaining servants, their faces pale in the lamplight. "Come away from that creature. Nothing good can come of it." "He's dying," Alara said, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Aye, and well he should." Thomas replied, stepping closer but keeping his distance from the still form. "Look at him. My lady, look at what he is. Your lord husband would turn in his grave to see you standing over one of their kind, with pity in your eyes." The words cut deep because they held truth. Robert had filled their evenings with tales of Saracen cruelty, of Christian souls tortured and towns burned, of an enemy that showed no mercy and deserved none in return. She had nodded and agreed, safe in her ignorance, comfortable in the certainty that the world was divided cleanly between good and evil, saved and damned. But now, staring down at this broken man whose breath misted in the cold air, she saw something that challenged every certainty she had built her grief upon. He was dying alone in foreign soil, far from whatever home had claimed him, and in that moment, his suffering looked exactly like her own. "Bring blankets," she said quietly, not looking away from the wounded stranger. "My lady, bring blankets and hot water." Her voice carried the authority of one born to command, though her hands trembled as she knelt beside the enemy who had somehow become, in the space of a heartbeat, simply a man in need of mercy. They carried him to the small chamber that had once housed visiting priests, a room tucked away from the main corridors where prying eyes might not venture. Old Marta, the only servant who had known Ilara since childhood, helped strip away the sodden robes with hands that shook more from fear than age, muttering prayers under her breath as if the very act of touching him might damn her soul. "This is madness, child," Marta whispered as they laid him on the narrow bed. "Harboring one of their kind beneath a Christian roof, what would your sainted mother say?" Ilara said nothing, her attention fixed on the task before her. In the lamplight, away from the storm's fury, she could see the full extent of his injuries. A deep gash ran along his left side, the edges clean as if made by a blade rather than rough travel. Smaller cuts decorated his arms and hands, and his knuckles bore the telltale marks of recent fighting. But it was what lay beside his wounds that caught her attention and held it. A string of smooth wooden beads wound around his wrist, each one carved with symbols that seemed to dance in the flickering light. When she lifted his hand to clean cut across his palm, the beads shifted with a sound like distant rain, and she found herself studying the careful craftsmanship, the way each bead had been shaped with reverence and skill. His sword, which Thomas had reluctantly brought inside, leaned against the wall like a sleeping serpent. The blade was finer than any weapon she had seen, the steel folded and worked with techniques that spoke of master smiths and noble patrons. The scabbard bore intricate patterns worked in silver and gold, designs that whispered of wealth and station far beyond that of a common soldier. "Look at his hands," Marta said softly, her earlier fear replaced by reluctant curiosity. "Those are not the hands of a barbarian." Indeed, his palms were marked by sword work and riding, but the fingers were long and graceful, unmarked by the calluses of menial labor. When Ilara turned his hand to examine a cut, she noticed a pale band of skin around one finger where a ring had recently rested, as if some precious ornament had been lost or hidden before whatever journey had brought him to her threshold. As she cleaned the wounds and bound them with strips of linen, she found herself studying his face with the same careful attention she had once given to illuminated manuscripts. His features held a nobility that had nothing to do with birth and everything to do with character, a dignity that sleep could not erase and suffering had not broken. "He's not what they told us he would be," she murmured, more to herself than to Marta. The old woman's eyes sharpened. "That, my child, is exactly what makes him dangerous." He woke like a man surfacing from deep water, consciousness returning in fragments that left him grasping for bearings in a world that had shifted beneath him while he slept. Ilara saw the exact moment awareness returned to his dark eyes, saw them widen with the particular terror of one who awakens in enemy territory, helpless and exposed. She had been changing his bandages when his breathing changed, became shallow and quick, with the rhythm of barely controlled panic. His hand moved instinctively toward where his sword should have been, found only empty air and rough linen, and the sound that escaped him was wordless, but filled with the desperation of the trapped. "Peace," Ilara said softly, stepping back to give him space while keeping her hands visible and empty. "You are safe here." He stared at her with the intensity of one trying to solve a riddle upon which his life depended. His gaze moved from her face to the chamber, taking in the simple furnishings, the cross above the door, the quality of the light that spoke of daylight beyond shuttered windows. When his eyes returned to hers, she saw intelligence there, and calculation, and something else that might have been confusion. She had brought water and bread, setting them on the small table beside the bed. Now she gestured toward them, her movement slow and deliberate. He watched every motion as if memorizing it, and when she lifted the cup to her own lips first, a gesture of trust and safety, something in his expression shifted. He tried to speak, and she heard the liquid syllables of a tongue that flowed like music, beautiful and utterly foreign. When she shook her head to indicate her lack of understanding, he fell silent for a long moment, studying her face with an attention that made her suddenly conscious of her plain dress, her unbound hair. Then he lifted his hand and pointed to himself, speaking a single word that sounded like honey poured over warm stone. "Khalil." When she repeated it, stumbling slightly over the unfamiliar sounds, his mouth curved in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Ilara," she replied, touching her own chest. He repeated her name with more grace than she had managed his, and the sound of it in his voice was like hearing a familiar prayer spoken in a new language, recognizable, yet transformed. The days that followed unfolded in a careful dance of gesture and patience. He drew maps in the dust on the floor, showed her the movements of prayer with hands that spoke of devotion deeper than words. She brought him books, watched his fingers trace the Latin script with understanding that betrayed an education her husband's stories had never mentioned, but it was when she caught him listening to her conversations with Marta that she realized the truth. His eyes too focused, too comprehending for one who understood nothing at all. The sound of hoofbeats in the courtyard came like thunder on a clear day, unexpected and ominous in its timing. Ilara heard them from the small chamber where she'd been reading to Khalil from one of her father's old texts, watching the way his eyes followed the Latin words with an understanding that grew more apparent each day. The measured rhythm of iron-shod horses on stone spoke of purpose and authority, and her blood chilled as she recognized the particular cadence of a knight's destrier. "Hide," she whispered urgently, and saw in Khalil's immediate stillness that he too understood the danger approaching. Without question, he moved to the narrow space behind the chamber's heavy tapestry, his movements quick and silent as shadow. Sir Godwin de Vere sat his black warhorse like a man accustomed to being obeyed without question, his broad frame encased in mail that had seen recent use. The links bore the telltale stains of travel and weather, and his surcoat displayed the red cross of one recently returned from the Holy Land. His grey eyes swept the courtyard with the methodical attention of a man who missed nothing and trusted less. "Lady Ilara," he called, his voice carrying the boom of one used to battlefield commands, "I seek shelter for myself and my men. The roads grow treacherous, and your hospitality is well remembered from better days." She descended the steps with measured grace, every gesture calculated to appear welcoming, while her mind raced through the implications of his presence. Godwin had been Robert's friend and fellow crusader, but he was also a man who saw the world in stark divisions of Christian and infidel, righteous and damned. "Sir Godwin, you are most welcome," she replied, gesturing for Thomas to see to his horse, "though I fear my table offers little worthy of a knight fresh from God's service." His eyes sharpened at her words, and she realized too late that she had revealed knowledge of his recent activities. Indeed, I have lately returned from Outremer, where Christian blood flows like water, and the infidel grows ever bolder. He dismounted with the fluid grace of a seasoned warrior, his gaze never leaving her face. Strange times call for vigilance, even in England's green fields. As they walked toward the great hall, Godwin's attention seemed to catalogue every detail. The state of the servants, the quality of the furnishings, the subtle signs that spoke of a household's true condition. When they passed the corridor leading to the guest chambers, Ilara felt his scrutiny like a physical weight. "You keep a quiet house, my lady," he observed, settling into the chair that had once been Robert's. "Perhaps too quiet for these troubled times. A woman alone must be careful of the company she keeps." The words carried layers of meaning that made her throat dry with fear. The discovery came not through accident, but through the methodical persistence of a man trained to hunt enemies in their hidden places. Godwin had spent the evening asking casual questions about servants, about provisions, about the strange quietude that seemed to permeate the manor like incense. When he rose before dawn, claiming restlessness, Ilara knew with sick certainty that her time had run out. She found him standing in the doorway of the guest chamber, his hand resting on his sword hilt with the casual readiness of one accustomed to violence. Khalil sat on the narrow bed, no longer attempting concealment, his dark eyes meeting Godwin's pale stare with a dignity that neither chains nor circumstances could diminish. "Well," Godwin said, his voice carrying the soft satisfaction of a hunter who had cornered his prey. "What have we here, Lady Ilara? A Saracen dog, comfortable in a Christian bed?" "He was wounded," Ilara said, stepping between them, though her voice shook with the magnitude of what had been revealed. "Dying in the storm." "I could not—" "You could not what?" Godwin's roar filled the small chamber. "Leave him to God's judgment? This creature whose kind butchered your husband, who has spilled Christian blood across the Holy Land," his sword whispered from its sheath. "Do you know what harboring such filth makes you? A traitor to your faith, to your king, to the memory of every good man who died fighting their accursed race." Khalil rose slowly, his movements careful and controlled, despite the obvious pain of his healing wounds. When he spoke, his words carried the authority of one born to command, though he addressed Godwin in flawless Norman French. "I am Khalil ibn Yusuf, cousin to Saladin and commander of the Damascus cavalry. If you would spill blood in a lady's chamber, Sir Knight, know that it flows from noble veins." The revelation struck the room like lightning. Godwin's face went white with rage and something else. Perhaps recognition of the name that had been whispered around Crusader campfires, with equal parts fear and grudging respect. "Saladin's cousin," he breathed. "Sweet Virgin Mary, Ilara, do you comprehend what you have done? This is not some common soldier, but one of their princes. The ransom alone could build a cathedral." His eyes glittered with avarice and fanatic purpose. "The church will want him. The king will want him. And you—" He turned his gaze on her like a blade. "You will hang for treason, unless you can prove this was not collaboration." Ilara stepped closer to Khalil, her chin raised in defiance that surprised even herself. "Then let them come." Bishop Aldrich arrived like winter itself, cloaked in authority and trailing the scent of incense and judgment. His retinue filled the Manor's great hall with the rustle of robes and the whispered Latin of men who carried God's word like a weapon. Ilara had seen him before at Robert's funeral, where his blessing had felt more like a pronouncement of doom than comfort. And now his pale eyes held the same cold certainty as he surveyed the tableau before him. Khalil stood with hands bound, though his bearing remained that of a prince receiving supplicants rather than a prisoner awaiting sentence. Godwin had insisted on the restraints, muttering about the unpredictability of infidel nobles, but the ropes seemed to diminish the knight more than his captive. "The matter before us Bishop Aldrich intoned, his voice echoing in the stone chamber, is one of heresy, treason, and the corruption of a Christian soul. His gaze settled on Ilara with the weight of final judgment. Lady Blackwood, you stand accused of harboring an enemy of Christ, of providing aid and comfort to one whose people have spilled the blood of the faithful. I stand accused of mercy, Ilara replied, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands, of seeing a dying man and choosing compassion over cruelty. The bishop's expression did not soften. Compassion without wisdom is the devil's snare, child. This man is cousin to Saladin himself, architect of Christian suffering. His value as prisoner could fund a dozen churches, yet you would shield him from God's justice. Khalil spoke then, his voice carrying across the hall with quiet dignity. I claim no protection save that which mercy grants, but I would ask that this lady not suffer for kindness shown to one who was beyond help to give or receive. Bishop Aldrich studied him with the interest of a scholar examining an unusual manuscript. You speak our tongue well for a heathen. Tell me, have you been baptized? Do you accept Christ as your Savior? I honor the God of Abraham, as my fathers did, and as your fathers did before the prophet walked among us. The answer drew sharp intakes of breath from the assembled monks, but the bishop merely nodded, as if confirming a diagnosis. Then your soul remains in darkness, and the lady's actions border upon apostasy. He turned back to Ilara. However, the Church recognizes that women are weak vessels, easily swayed by misguided emotion. There is yet a path to redemption. Ilara felt the trap closing around her like iron bands. What path? Marriage, the bishop said simply. Let this infidel be baptized and take you as wife under Christian law. Thus his presence in your chamber becomes not adultery, but matrimony. His conversion becomes your salvation, and the Church gains a soul rather than losing one. The silence that followed felt like the pause between lightning and thunder, heavy with the promise of upheaval. The chapel had never felt so small, its stone walls pressing close like a tomb, as the assembled witnesses filled the narrow space with their whispered prayers and barely concealed anticipation. Local lords and their wives had come to witness what would be spoken of in hushed tones for generations, the marriage of a crusader's widow to a Saracen prince, sanctified by the Church and stained with the complexity of survival. Khalil stood before the altar in borrowed robes, the rough, brown wool of a monk's habit replacing the rich garments that had marked his station. The baptism had been swift and perfunctory, holy water dripping from his dark hair like tears as Bishop Aldrich pronounced his Christian rebirth with words that felt more like a burial than a resurrection. Now he bore the name Christopher, though it sat upon him like ill-fitting armor, never quite concealing what lay beneath. Ilara approached in her finest gown, the deep blue silk that had been her wedding dress 3 years before, its golden threads catching the candlelight like captured stars. But where once she had walked this path with trembling joy, now each step felt like a march toward some necessary sacrifice, her face composed in the mask of duty that had sustained her through countless obligations. The bishop's voice rolled through the Latin phrases with ceremonial weight, each word binding them together with chains forged of law and necessity rather than choice. The witnesses leaned forward as if witnessing some exotic entertainment, the taming of both infidel and willful widow in a single ceremony. Do you, Christopher, take this woman? When Khalil answered in the required tongue, his voice carried quiet dignity that no forced name could diminish. But it was when the bishop turned to her that the world shifted, narrowed to the space between two pairs of eyes, meeting across an altar that had become both sanctuary and trap. Do you, Ilara, take this man? She looked at Khalil then, truly looked at him for the first time since entering the chapel. What she saw was not the enemy her husband had died fighting, not the exotic prize the church had claimed, but a man standing with her in the space between what was demanded and what was chosen. In his dark eyes, she glimpsed something that made her breath catch, not gratitude or resignation, but a recognition that mirrored her own. "I do," she whispered, and the words carried weight beyond their legal meaning. When the bishop pronounced them man and wife, and Khalil leaned forward to place the ceremonial kiss upon her lips, their eyes remained locked. In that moment, something passed between them that had nothing to do with bishops or baptisms or the satisfied murmur of witnesses. It was the first whisper of something that might, in time, grow into choice. The days that followed their wedding unfolded like pages in an illuminated manuscript, each one revealing new patterns in the careful dance they had begun. Khalil moved through the manor, with the quiet grace of one learning to inhabit a space that was both prison and sanctuary, while Ilara found herself studying him with the attention she had once reserved for her father's maps of distant lands. He rose before dawn, as was his custom, and she would often find him in the courtyard performing movements that flowed like water and struck like lightning. "Prayers made flesh," he explained when she asked, "a way of speaking to Allah through the body's devotion." She had expected to feel discomfort at such foreign worship, but instead found herself drawn to the quiet reverence in his gestures. In return, she showed him the rhythms of English manor life, the blessing of bread before meals, the way to read, whether in the behavior of birds, the delicate negotiations required to maintain harmony among servants who had known her since childhood. Old Thomas still watched him with wary eyes, but even the steward could not argue with Khalil's careful attention to the tasks he was given. It was when Khalil began working with the horses that the last barriers began to crumble. The destrier that had been Robert's pride, a great black beast that had grown sullen and difficult in the years since his master's death, gentled under Khalil's touch like a colt seeking comfort. The servants gathered to watch in amazement as he whispered to the animal in his own tongue, his hands moving over the horse's neck with a knowledge that spoke of desert winds and endless horizons. "In my land," he told Ilara as she stood beside him in the stable, "we say that horses are God's gift to remind us that strength and gentleness can share the same heart." She found herself teaching him in return the names of herbs in her garden, the stories carved into the stones of the chapel, the way morning mist gathered in the valleys like a promise of rain. When he struggled with English words, she would guide his pronunciation with patient repetition, their faces growing close over shared books as lamplight flickered between them. One evening, as she tended a cut on his hand, earned while repairing a section of wall that had crumbled in the spring thaw, she realized that her touch no longer carried the careful distance of duty. When their eyes met across the small space between them, she saw her own recognition reflected there. Somewhere, in the accumulation of ordinary moments, something extraordinary had begun to take root. "What are we becoming?" she asked softly. His answer came like a prayer, perhaps something neither of us expected to find. The attack came with the summer dawn, smoke rising from the village of Millhaven like a black prayer against the pale sky. Ilara saw it first from the solar window where she had been reading, the distant column of darkness that spoke of burning thatch and human terror. By the time she reached the courtyard, Khalil was already saddling Robert's destrier with movements sharp and purposeful as a blade being drawn. "Brigands!" Thomas gasped, stumbling into the yard with news brought by a fleeing Kotar. "They came before first light, 20 men or more. The miller's wife sent her boy running before they took the bridge." Khalil swung into the saddle with fluid grace, his borrowed sword hanging at his side like a familiar prayer. For a moment, Ilara saw not the converted prisoner who shared her name and board, but the cavalry commander who had once struck fear. "Into crusader hearts beneath eastern suns. This is not your fight," she said, though even as the words left her lips she knew their falsehood. His dark eyes found hers across the morning air. "A man's home is where he chooses to make his stand. These are my people now." She understood then that this moment had been building since the night she found him bleeding in the storm. Every shared meal, every quiet conversation, every gesture of growing trust leading to this choice that would define them both. Without hesitation, she called for her own mount. They rode toward Millhaven with a handful of Manor men, but it was the sight of Khalil thundering into combat that turned the tide. He fought like desert wind made flesh, his curved blade singing through the morning air as he cut through the raiders' ranks with precision that spoke of battles fought on distant sands. When Ilara's sword found its mark in a brigand's shoulder, protecting a cowering family, she glimpsed something fierce and proud in Khalil's expression, not surprise, but recognition. The villagers who emerged from their hiding places saw them, standing together in the aftermath, breathing hard and streaked with honest sweat, their swords red with the blood of those who would prey upon the innocent. An old woman whose granddaughter Khalil had shielded with his own body stepped forward and pressed a piece of bread into his hands. "God's blessing on you both," she whispered, and in her voice was the sound of acceptance earned rather than demanded. As they rode home through fields now safe for harvest, Ilara felt the weight of what had shifted. They were no longer the forced union of convenience and conversion, but something rarer, partners who had chosen each other in the only way that truly mattered, with blade and blood and the willingness to stand together against whatever darkness might come. They came like ghosts from a war that refused to end, 3 knights bearing the weathered crosses of those who had walked in Jerusalem's shadow and tasted its bitter victories. Sir Aldred led them, Robert's sword brother and closest friend, his once golden beard now streaked with grey, and his eyes holding the hollow distance of one who had seen too much death to ever fully return home. Ilara stood in the great hall beside. Khalil, their unity a declaration that needed no words, but she felt the weight of her past settling around her shoulders like a shroud. These men had loved Robert as she once had shared his bread and his battles, and in their faces she saw the ghost of everything she had chosen to leave behind. "Sweet Mary's tears," Aldred breathed, his gaze fixed on Khalil with recognition that struck like lightning. "Khalil ibn Yusuf, we saw you at Hattin, saw you cut down Geoffrey de Montfort with that curved devil's blade." His hand moved to his sword. "How many good Christians did you send to early graves, infidel?" "As many as tried to take mine," Khalil replied with quiet dignity. "War makes killers of us all, Sir Knight." The truth of it hung in the air like incense, heavy and inescapable. Sir Aldred's companions shifted restlessly, their hands seeking familiar weapon hilts, but it was the older knight's words that cut deepest. "Robert loved you unto death, Ilara. We buried him beneath Syrian stones while calling your name, and we swore to return and tell you how bravely he fell." His voice broke with genuine grief, to find his memory dishonored by this mockery of marriage to his very enemy. "Robert is dead," Ilara said softly, each word a blade turned against her own heart. 3 years in the ground, while I have been living. "Living?" Aldred's laugh held no mirth. "Is that what you call it? Wedding the man whose people spilled your husband's blood, sharing your bed with one who would have cut Robert's throat given the chance?" Khalil stepped forward then, his movement careful and controlled. "If my presence brings her dishonor, I will go. Let her choose freely what her heart demands." The offer hung between them like a challenge, and Ilara felt the moment crystallize around her, past and present, memory and possibility, the woman she had been and the woman she was becoming. In the silence, she could almost hear Robert's voice. young and certain, speaking of crusades and glory and enemies clearly defined. But it was Khalil's hand she reached for. His fingers she laced with her own as she faced the men who carried her first husband's ghost. "I choose love over memory," she said, her voice carrying across the hall like a bell. "I choose the man who stands with me against the dark." The leaving came not with fanfare, but with the quiet determination of those who understand that freedom sometimes requires the abandonment of everything familiar. As autumn painted the countryside in shades of gold and crimson, Ilara stood in the solar, where she had first glimpsed the smoke of Millhaven's burning, now watching Khalil load their few possessions onto the cart with the same careful attention. He brought to everything he touched. They would take little: clothing, books, the carved wooden bird Khalil had fashioned for her during the long winter of their growing understanding. The manor itself, with its stone memories and political complications, would pass to Robert's distant cousin, a man who cared more for rents than for the scandals that had unfolded within these walls. Old Thomas wept as they prepared to depart, his weathered hands pressed to Ilara's in blessing and farewell. "Where will you go, my lady?" he asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer mattered less than the going itself. "North," she replied simply, "to lands where no one knows our names or cares about the crosses we've borne." Marta had chosen to come with them, her loyalty proving stronger than her fear, and young Will the stable boy had begged to follow, drawn by stories of horses that flew like wind across desert sands. They made a small company, but one bound by choice rather than obligation. The journey took them through forests where ancient oaks whispered secrets older than Christianity or Islam, past villages where their story was unknown and their difference unremarked. Khalil taught Will the eastern ways of horse training during long days on the road, while Ilara and Marta gathered herbs whose names had travelled from Constantinople to Canterbury in the pouches of pilgrims and merchants. They found their sanctuary in a valley where 3 rivers met, the land rich and unclaimed, far enough from the great roads that curiosity seldom ventured there. The house they built was neither grand nor humble, but something new: timber and stone, arranged with Eastern understanding of wind and Western knowledge of rain, a dwelling that belonged to neither tradition and therefore to both. On the evening, they raised the ridgepole. Khalil stood beside Ilara in the doorway, watching the sunset paint their valley in shades of gold and amber. She felt his hand find hers with the easy familiarity of those who had learned to read each other's thoughts. In silence, "Do you regret it?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of all they had sacrificed. Ilara looked out at the land they would cultivate together, the home they would fill with laughter and perhaps children who would grow up knowing love as a bridge rather than a battlefield. "Never," she whispered, and meant it like a prayer.